What's going on, everybody? This is Afro Think Tank. White woman exposes what the white supremacists that don't want to take it, that don't want to take responsibility for their actions in America. She exposes what they're trying to teach their children. All right, about slavery. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's the same thing Donald Trump's trying to do with all the black museums, all the Native American museums. They want to make it look like, oh, it wasn't so bad. No, they always a part of it. And listen, no matter how many times white people tell you, never believe them when they tell you that we had slavery in Africa the same way they had slavery. We didn't have slavery. We had indentured servitude, okay? There was no such thing as jails. So if you were fighting your op, meaning one nation was fighting another nation, and I captured some of your soldiers, guess what happened? You work for us now. You become a part of our community. Because in war, if you lose men, you need to replenish your men. And if the men were fighting, guess what? You're going to take your manliness and you're going to contribute to our community. And that's what happened. And many of them did. And they had great lives because they served their time, right? They did their thing and they were able to own land. They were able to get married. They were still human beings. They weren't slaves. They weren't chattel. White people and what they call slavery is something completely different from anything Africans ever did. It's more akin to what the Arabs did, because they're bloodthirsty savages. Europeans are bloodthirsty Neanderthal savages. So of course they were way more brutal, way more brutal. In Africa, this is the way of life. Just like in certain parts of Asia, it was the way of life. What do you think the white people did to their captives when they were fighting each other, the French and the English? Huh? Usually they just murdered the rest of them, or they put them in freaking gulags or goddamn freaking their version of jail, the goddamn holes and shit. Tortured them for fun. Had picnics with white folk. That's what they did. But what I'm going to do is, because I got plenty of videos that's describing what African slavery was, which I like to call and categorize slavery, and the difference between that type of slavery, or what we would call indentured servitude, right? Especially if you were a criminal, you stole. Like, we didn't have jail, so that means you had to pay your penance to society, right? And the white person's capitalism, because that's what it is. Capitalism slavery. Chattel slavery is capitalism. All right. So I'm going to put some little information at the end so we can declutter our minds. A lot of FBA believe this. That's why you mad at Africans, because you think that they just extended their brutality and allowed Europeans to take part, right? Instead of understanding what's true. A lot of your pissed offness and your pistivity is based off false information. And we're going to debunk that shit right now, even though I know most of y'all who are FBA won't care, because the truth doesn't mean anything when y'all playing for teams. Anyway, that's all I got to say. This is Afro Think Tank. Learn something, teach something. I'm out.
So my 5-year-old brought home a book today from her Texas public school library entitled African Americans in the Colonies. Let me hit you with some highlights. The first black people in Jamestown were a group of Africans from Barbados. They were brought there by Dutch traders, and Englishman John Rolfe bought them. The blacks probably spoke English, and like English indentured servants, might have eventually earned their freedom. Antonio, a Negro, arrived in Jamestown in 1621. He was owned by the Bennett family, who praised his hard work and loyalty. Antonio married a black woman named Mary, eventually earned his and his family's freedom. He became a landowner and changed his name to Anthony Johnson. In the early days of Jamestown, settlers didn't use words like white or black to describe themselves. They would refer themselves or each other as English, Christian, or perhaps servants, who could be either white or black. Anthony Johnson enjoyed the same rights, freedom, and respect as any white servant who became successful by working hard. But as tobacco farms became bigger, the need for laborers grew, and the amount of English people willing to come to America as indentured servants was shrinking. So they turned to slavery. Slavery was not new to the people from Africa, where warring tribes often turned prisoners into slaves. In Africa, slaves lived and worked with the family who owned them. Slaves were considered unequal, but they were treated like other family members. This is similar to the experiences of early slaves in America, who worked alongside their white owners and probably slept in the same house. The first Africans in North America spent time among the Europeans. They could speak English and often converted to Christianity. They sometimes won their freedoms by claiming that as Christians they deserved it, or they bought their freedom with the money they earned in their free time. By the mid-1600s, 1 in 5 black people in North America was free. But then the laws regarding slavery became stricter. African slaves entered Carolina the same way as the other colonies from the West Indies. They usually spoke English and they enjoyed some privileges in their life of hard work, but these privileges did not last long in Carolina. These farms gave way to plantations, and slaves were brought directly from Africa to the busy slave ports of Charlestown and the Chesapeake Bay. As the black population of the colonies grew, white lawmakers made it harder for Africans to prosper. Once, a slave like Anthony Johnson could earn his freedom and live a good life if he worked hard. Now, the land he knew was vanishing. Now, Africans like John Punch were seen just as one way, permanent slaves, property of their owners. This chapter is called Recreating Africa in America. That's how we're describing slavery. We're just recreating Africa because, as you know, 11-year-old Odula Equino was kidnapped from their African home by black slave traders. He was heartbroken when he was separated, and he was eventually sold to some white slave traders, where he saw white slave traders for the first time. Life was difficult for slaves who came directly from Africa because they didn't speak English. They worked long hours. They had few chances to learn other skills besides farming. White people, especially in the South, became more fearful of Africans as their numbers grew. Whites used fear and sometimes severe punishment to control black slaves. Conditions slowly began to improve as the next generation of slaves demanded more rights. Family life was important to the Africans. The white slave owners learned that keeping families together meant fewer slaves would run away. Slaves wanted more free time. For a while, plantation slaves worked 7 days a week. Then they were given Sundays, the traditional day of rest off from work. Slaves again began growing vegetables or raising chickens to sell and hired themselves out to non-slave owners after finishing their plantation work. By earning extra money, slave parents could improve the way their families ate and lived. If you're worried about the black boy we read about a moment ago with the black slave traders, don't worry. He grew tall and strong, and after a long, hard day's work, he worked even more to save money to purchase his freedom. When one of his owners abused him, he complained to the Connecticut Justice of the Peace. The man apologized, but said in his defense there were no laws to protect slaves. Finally, at age 36, he bought his freedom from his master. Slave owners often lived in fear of rebellions or uprising against them. And then they talk about one that happened where a band of 20 slaves led by a man named Jemmy left their owners and headed south, where they killed more than 20 white people that day. The cause of liberty inspired many white Americans to think harder about the morality of slavery. Many decided that human beings owning other human beings was wrong. Thousands of Africans were freed by their owners after the war ended. Even George Washington freed his slaves. At the end of the 1700s, the northern states were abolishing slavery. Some southern states made it easier for slave owners to free their slaves. It would take the long and bloody Civil War to completely abolish slavery in the United States, and that is the end. So my 5-year-old brought home a book today.
Servitude in Africa versus European chattel slavery in the Atlantic world. A comparative PhD level brief. Bottom line, pre-colonial Africa did have multiple forms of bondage: domestic slavery, military slavery, debt pawnship, indenture, for example, Iwofa among the Yoruba, and, in some places and periods, plantation-like estates. But these systems were typically not racialized, were often assimilative into kinship or clientage, and did not, as a rule, make slave status heritable in perpetuity. European chattel slavery in the Americas was distinct, a legally codified, racial, hereditary, market-commodified regime on an unprecedented scale, designed to extract labor and reproduction as property across generations. One defined terms to avoid false equivalence. African slavery servitude, variegated, encompassed domestic servitude, war captivity slavery, palace and military slavery, and debt pawnship, time-bound indenture of a person as collateral, with wide variation across regions and centuries. Status could be mutable through manumission, incorporation, or marriage. Children's status was not uniformly enslaved. European Atlantic chattel slavery, in law and practice, people of African descent were movable property. Their children inherited bondage, part of sequitur ventrem. Slavery was explicitly racialized and permanent, unless manumitted. Bodies were fungible commodities insured, mortgaged, and traded. 2. What bondage on the African continent actually looked like. Domestic kinship slavery and incorporation. Many enslaved persons were absorbed into households, could marry, own limited property, and sometimes rise to influence. Enslaved status could be attenuated over time. This is the classic incorporation, rather than absolute alienability contrast highlighted by Mears and Kopitoff and others. Debt pawnship, African indenture. Among the Yoruba Iwofa bound a person, often a dependent, as collateral to work off a loan, time-limited and contractual, with social constraints on abuse, closer to indenture peonage than to perpetual chattel slavery. Military and palace slavery, regional extremes, there were harsh forms, e.g. plantation-like estates in the 19th century Sokoto Caliphate and clove plantations in Zanzibar, demonstrating that parts of Africa evolved high-coercion labor systems, especially in the 1800s. But these were later, region-specific developments and still varied in legal philosophy from Atlantic racial chattel. Scholarly consensus, form, scale, and legal logics in Africa differed markedly from Atlantic chattel slavery, even while violence and exploitation certainly existed in Africa. What Europeans built in the Americas and why it's not the same. Hereditary status by law, Virginia, 1662, fixed maternal descent partus sequitur ventrum, making slavery self-reproducing, successors across English America adopted it. Barbados, 1661, codified enslaved Africans as chattels, property akin to livestock or goods. Racialization and total commodification slave codes treated Africans and their descendants as a racially marked labor caste, fully alienable and insurable, as chillingly visible in the Zong insurance case after 130-plus captives were murdered at sea. Scale and mortality. When 12.5 million people embarked from Africa, about 10.7 million survive the Middle Passage to the Americas. The rest perished en route. Mortality was especially high before late 18th century improvements. 4 core differences at a glance. 1. Heritability. Africa, many systems, children often did not automatically inherit slave status. Pathways to incorporation, manumission existed. Atlantic chattel, children of enslaved women, always enslaved by law, making bondage intergenerational and perpetual. 2. Racial logic. Africa, status not anchored to a transgenerational racial caste. Atlantic, laws and practice created a racialized slave order defining blackness as enslavable and enslaved. 3. Property status and alienability. Africa, enslaved persons frequently embedded in household kin networks, alienability constrained by custom. Atlantic, people were full chattel, bought, sold, insured, seized for debt. 4. Temporal horizon. Africa, pawnship, indentured, often time-limited obligations tied to debt or war. Atlantic, lifelong servitude by default, freedom required legal manumission. 5. Marriage, family, and social mobility. Africa, many locales permitted marriage, family formation, and eventual social mobility. Atlantic, marriages lacked standing, family separation was routine market practice. 6. Economic structure. Africa, multi-purpose labor, domestic, military, artisanal, plantation sectors existed but were regionally limited and later. Atlantic, monocrop plantation capitalism, sugar, then cotton, etc., drove mass importation and coercion. Caveat for accuracy, some African regimes, for example, Dahomey Sokoto Zanzibar, could be extremely violent and extractive, acknowledging that does not erase the fundamental legal, racial, and hereditary differences that defined Atlantic chattel slavery. 5. Indentured servitude across regions, African pawnship, Asian indenture, and native servitude. A. African pawnship, EWOFA, closest African analog to indenture. Contractual collateralization of labor for a debt, typically time-bounded obligations to feed, protect pawns. Abuses existed but were socially and legally mediated. This is not perpetual heritable chattel status. B. Asian indenture after Atlantic slavery. Indian indenture 1834 to 1917 moved greater than 1.3 million people across the empire on 3 to 5 year contracts, often renewable, pitched as free labor, but enforced by penal sanctions, imprisonment for breach, past systems, and severe constraints on mobility and family life. Critics in Britain called it a new system of slavery. Chinese coolie contracts to Cuba, Peru, 1847 to 1874, were likewise rife with deception, debt entrapment, violence, and high mortality, prompting the 1873 to 74 Chinese Commission to Cuba and the eventual suppression of the trade. Similarity, time-bounded contracts on paper, difference, not heritable, and not racially defined as chattel. C. Native American captivity, servitude after war or for crimes. In colonial North America, indigenous people were enslaved or indentured after warfare, for example, Pequot War, 1637, and under just war and penal doctrines, captives were sold locally or exported to the Caribbean. In other areas, captives could be adopted into kin networks, for example, some Comanche practices. This system blended captivity, household labor, and punishment, but again was not a heritable, racialized chattel regime on the Atlantic scale. Shared features across pawnship, indenture, penal servitude, formal contracts or communal sanction, time limits, at least nominally, restricted mobility, corporal discipline, and possibilities of return or adoption, all fundamentally different from Atlantic chattel principles of perpetual heritable racial property. Sixth scale and dehumanization matter. The Atlantic system's defining characteristics were racial heritability, total alienability, and scale. Millions funneled through a transoceanic market with 10.7 million disembarking alive in the Americas. Slave codes and insurance law treated human beings as cargo. This is why historians reject the claim that African servitude and Atlantic slavery are the same. The form, law, and intent were categorically different. Further reading, foundational scholarship, Paul Lovejoy, Transformations in Slavery, John K. Thornton, Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World, Suzanne Mears and Igor Kopitov, Slavery in Africa, Orlando Patterson, Slavery and Social Death, David Eltis and David Richardson, Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, Andres Resendez, The Other Slavery, Walton Look Lie, Indentured Labor, Caribbean Sugar, Moon Ho Jung, Coolies and Cane. For accessible overviews, see the Oxford Research Encyclopedia entries linked above. Citations, key selections. Oxford Research Encyclopedia, Slavery in Africa, Overview of African Systems. Partus Sequitur Ventrim, Virginia 1662, and Barbados Slave Code 1661, Primary Analysis Sources. Slave Voyages, or Demography, 12.5 minutes embarked, 10.7 minutes arrived, Middle Passage Mortality. Zong Massacre, as insurance case context, Yoruba Iwofa, Indenture Pawnship, Indian Indenture Contract, Penal Enforcement, and Chinese Coolie Investigations. Native Servitude After War, Penal Logics, Pequot, War Enslavement.
Free Sudan! Boycott diamonds and gold! Free Sudan! Boycott diamonds and gold! We most definitely cannot forget about the people of Sudan!
Wait. Before you go, for all my subscribers and philanthropists out there, I'm building a solar power community water bowl system in Nigeria. It's going to cost between $5,000 and $6,000. I'm trying to raise money. If you want to participate and help me build this solar power water system, please donate to the Cash App and put solar water in the notes. Solar water in the notes. I'll put PayPal, Stripe, and Zelle. Anyway, thank you. That's all I got to say. It's Afro Think Tank. Learn something, teach something. I'm out. Thanks for watching Afro Think Tank. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And follow me on Substack and Patreon for more content. Remember, it's Pan-Africanism or nothing.